Jacobson versus Massachusetts, State Authority in Public Health Emergencies. Facts. Smallpox was a serious health concern in the U.S. at the beginning of the 20th century. Because of these considerations, Massachusetts implemented policies granting municipal health officials the authority to require smallpox vaccines. Henning Jacobson objected, mentioning that he had previously experienced negative effects from the vaccine. He asserted that receiving a forced vaccine constituted a violation of his rights to personal freedom. He sought an appeal, saying that the law violated his rights, even after paying the punishment. Procedural history. Henning Jacobson refused to have a vaccine for his children, as was required by law. His concern was founded on an earlier unfavorable response to the immunization. Following the penalty for declining, Jacobson brought a lawsuit and appealed the Cambridge District Court's decision, in which the court maintained the law's legitimacy. Despite this outcome, Jacobson came to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which maintained the decision of the previous instance. Jacobson filed a mistrial complaint in the U.S. Supreme Court, seeking more redress since he was unhappy with previous decisions. The situation was brought before the highest court in the country to examine the constitutional concerns brought up by the statute requiring vaccinations. The matter was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court on a writ of error. After considering the reasons presented by both sides, the U.S. Supreme Court decided. The court maintained the legislation in a nearly unanimous decision, maintaining the authority of the state to mandate vaccinations for its people in times of public health emergency. Issue presented. The main contention in the case was the conflict between private rights and the state's emergency public health protection authority. In particular, the issue concerned the constitutionality of the state's ability to implement immunization laws even when they seem to disrespect a person's right to privacy and personal autonomy guaranteed by the Constitution. Therefore, finding a middle ground between a person's autonomous rights and the state's duty to uphold the interests of the larger community is crucial. Determining whether the state has the right to use its police powers to take actions that would limit people's liberties, especially in an emergency involving public health, was necessary. The case looked at the boundaries of governmental authority and questioned whether the state had the right to enforce such laws for the benefit of the public, notwithstanding opposition from individuals like Jacobson. In the end, this ruling set a precedent that confirmed the authority of the state to impose such laws to safeguard people's safety and health. Holding. The court upheld the existing procedures, establishing an important precedent for the state's ability to enforce decrees of this kind for the defense of public safety and health. The important ruling maintained that the state has a right to safeguard public health within the scope of its police authority. It underlined how crucial these interests were, especially in times of emergency like the outbreak of smallpox that prompted the act. The court emphasized that the state's obligation to safeguard the general good justified the adoption of reasonable laws, even if they limit individual liberty. It acknowledged the significance of avoiding the spread of illness and preserving public welfare. The decision concluded that the vaccine requirement ordinance was a proper application of state security authority. It proved that, in these crucial circumstances, individual liberties and objections cannot take the place of the greater good. This ruling established a precedent for future cases concerning the conflict between public health initiatives and individual liberty by stressing that personal freedoms are not unassailable and that the government may lawfully impose restrictions on them to preserve public health. Legal reasoning. Future lawsuits concerning the tension between an individual's right to privacy and the state's authority to impose public health measures in times of emergency will be guided by the legal rationale established in the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case. The rationale for the vaccination's need and efficacy in halting the spread of infectious illnesses was derived from medical consensus and historical practice. It acknowledged that vaccination was a generally acknowledged and effective strategy for halting the spread of illnesses like smallpox and promoting public health and safety. The court said that the state police can enforce acceptable laws in emergencies, stressing that this authority includes taking appropriate action to solve public health issues. It also highlighted how important it is to strike a careful balance between people's rights and the government's duty to safeguard the general welfare. It acknowledged that, Notwithstanding people's objections to vaccination, societal constraints on personal liberties are necessary to stop the spread of contagious illnesses during emergencies. Rule of law. This decision reaffirmed the idea that governments can adopt legitimate laws to safeguard public health and safety in times of emergency, provided they stay within the bounds of their police authorities. It highlighted the duty of the state to advance societal well-being, even at the expense of limiting some personal liberties. The decision affirmed that restrictions on individual rights might be justified when doing so serves the greater good and supported the validity of legislation requiring vaccinations during public health emergencies. This served as a foundation for evaluating the appropriateness of government action, especially when public health is in jeopardy. It underlined that personal liberties are not unassailable, particularly in times of emergency, and that the government may legitimately restrict them to address urgent public health issues. This acknowledgement underlined that when a person's liberties collide with society's larger objectives of maintaining public health and safety, those liberties may be restricted. As a result of the case, future legal issues pertaining to the proper balance between individual rights and the government's obligation to safeguard public health during emergencies would be based on this precedent, which was set for evaluating the government's ability to implement public health measures. Thus, the case still has an impact on legal theory and policy, especially when it comes to questions about public health emergencies and the government's ability to enact social programs. Concurring or dissenting opinions. Despite the nearly unanimous conclusion, there were disagreements and discussions about the scope of governmental authority, individual liberties, and the function of government involvement in public health issues. The court's judgment had no overt dissenting opinions, which was indicative of the justices' general agreement that the government has the right to impose vaccination requirements on citizens in the event of a public health emergency. While the judge's judgment was unanimous, some analysts speculate that their opinions on the boundaries of individual rights and governmental authority may have differed. These subtleties have not been expressed in the written dissenting opinions either.